Hello and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see all of you here today for our fourth and final day of the Technical Assistance Institute. I'm Donna Meltzer. I'm the CEO of NACDD and so happy to have all of you with us today. I just wanted to take a quick minute and welcome all of you and thank all of our partners and everybody who has made this event possible. I first want to thank our friends at the Administration for Community Living, Administration on Disabilities, and Office on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Yes, I know that's a whole lot of acronyms, but again, I just want to thank all of our team at OIDD for their partnership, for their trust in us to put on opportunities like this TAI for all of you so that we can learn together, grow together, and develop practices together. And most importantly, we are together moving towards change. So I thank all of our colleagues at AOD, OIDD. I also want to thank our ITAC staff, Angela Castillo-Epps and Cheryl Matney, who have done such an extraordinary job putting all of this together. And finally, I want to thank all of you, our presenters, our DD Council teams, all of you who come to this with open minds and open hearts. You're always willing to share what you're doing with your councils for the greater good so that we can all learn from you and look at our best and most promising practices and better understand some of the most critical issues of our day. So thank you again, everybody, for being here, for being with us. I hope that you will learn a tremendous amount today. I'm very excited about today's program and our guest presenters who will be on very shortly. And please know that at the end of the day, there will be a survey for you to fill out. This really helps us to know if we're getting the right information to you and how we can continue to improve upon what we present for you and how we help you to learn. So again, thanks for being here for our virtual event today.
Thanks so much, Donna and Jen, for all that great information. We have so much to share today. I am just going to jump right in and introduce our plenary speakers to provide a framework on advancing equity. Please know that we certainly can't cover everything with regard to this topic in the limited time that we have today. So I'm very excited to let you know that we are in the process of scheduling a post-Technical Assistance Institute peer-to-peer conversation so we can learn even more from our guests and from each other. So please keep a lookout for that information that will be coming to you after the Technical Assistance Institute. You can, as Jen just said, you're welcome to put questions in the boxes. Please know that if we do not get to your question today, we will follow up. So again, we have limited time, and since we have that extra learning opportunity, please know that you will get the question addressed. As you know, you can always contact me directly for anything on diversity, inclusion, and cultural linguistic competence. So now I'd like to turn it over to two of my beloved colleagues, Tawara Good, the director of Georgetown University National Center for Cultural Competence and the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, and also Wendy Jones, Senior Policy Associate and Research Instructor, also from the National Center for Cultural Competence, Center for Child and Human Development. Welcome, Tawara and Wendy.
Thank you, Angela. And I thank NACDD, all of the staff and members, and also the ITAC team for this opportunity. I am going to start to share my screen. We have a short amount of time with you, only 30 minutes, and we will see what we can get through in that time frame. As you can see from our title, we're looking at advancing equity in the current climate, harnessing the role of DD councils. And Wendy and I will share presentations here, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. So our agenda for today really is to look at how do we differentiate equity from diversity and inclusion, and then we will describe the implications of equity in the IDD space. So Wendy, take it away.
Sure. We wanted to start out with a polling question. And the question is, has your council defined equity and what it means for intellectual and developmental disabilities? So if we could, we have actually 4 options for you to select, and the polling question will come up. One answer is yes, no, don't know, or in progress. So if you take the opportunity to respond to this question, and then we'll share what the responses are with everyone. So open the question, the polling question, please.
The question is open. Yeah.
Thank you for responding, everyone.
Jennifer, if you could let Wendy know when we're getting near the response quotient.
It is nearing that now. I would say I can go ahead and close it now and share the results. Okay, and are you seeing the results, Wendy?
I am, thank you. So what we see is that about 22% or 33% of people say they don't know. 21% say that it's in progress, that the council is in the progress or in the process of defining equity and what it means in developmental and intellectual disabilities. 26% say no, and 20% say yes. So it's sort of interestingly split, and that will have some implications for how we are moving forward and what our understanding of equity is in this IDD space. Thank you so much. If you would close the poll, we'll move forward.
Everybody can just X out of the poll. And thank you.
All right. So we're here to really look at equity. However, we have to look at the term and concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion because we hear those terms all together. And I like to ask, which one? Which one are we talking about? Because actually DEI has really become an acronym. And I say literally because people are not really looking at distinguishing diversity from inclusion from equity. And so that's very important when we look at these concepts and these practices. And Wendy and I are just going to go very quickly over how we begin to differentiate those terms. Wendy.
So when we think about diversity, it's really the idea or the condition of being composed of differing elements or qualities. So difference, right? But difference in, and it's reflecting or sort of manifesting itself differently in different areas. So when we think about it in terms of culture, Tawar is going to get into that. Tawar is going to take it a little bit further into a deeper dive for culture.
So as we think about diversity, it could be diversity in almost anything, in geographic locale, in diversity of thought. However, when we're thinking about the work that councils are charged to do, especially looking at the DD Act, you might want to consider using the concept and term cultural diversity. And this is helping us to distinguish diversity from many other aspects of diversity. And so as we think about broadly cultural diversity, it includes racial and ethnic classification and identities, nationality, language, religion, all of the things that are listed there on the screen. And it really helps us to distinguish one person or one group from another. As we think about persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's also important for us to think about multiple cultural identities. That in particular, that one's identity as having a disability is only one identity, one of many identities that come to the table. We know that people compartmentalize their identities. There are things that may share and things they may not share. We know that some people mostly identify with one, again, identity or cultural group over another. I'm going to share with you a quote from Andy Arias, who's one of our colleagues, who I think makes perfect sense when we talk about multiple cultural identities. And this is classic Andy speak, I will say that. Andy says, I come to the table with my LGBTQ-ness, my Hispanicness, and my disability. Neither overshadows the other. Neither is more important than the other. They're all part of who I am as a person. I think that's really critical in terms of thinking how Andy describes his multiple cultural identities. We'll now also look at the term of intersectionality, and we're hearing this a lot, including in the disability space. I want to really share with you what intersectionality means, at least from the framework, the definition and view that we use at the National Center for Cultural Competence and also at our UCED. So Kimberly Quinshaw is a person who really created this term way back in the 90s. She wrote about how her membership and that of other women who are Black often resulted in discrimination, oppression, and marginalization. And so that was very important in her framework. As we see now in terms of how the intersectionality is indeed used, we see a lot of people using it, including in the IDD space, I would say not consistent with this framework, that they're actually using it as multiple cultural identities in terms of what Andy said. And so as we think about using the term intersectionality, what's very important to include is the harm. Because in this concept of intersectionality, it's looking at what society imposes on members of diverse groups, that as a result of that, result in discrimination, marginalization, and oppression. And so again, we think it's important to be able to distinguish these terms. And again, we go back to Andy, who says, from childhood through adult life, I experienced stereotyping, marginalization, and discrimination just because of who I am, because of my LGBTQ-ness, my Hispanicness, and my disability. And so as we think about understanding diversity and cultural diversity, we really need to be a little more nuanced in looking at these important factors. Wendy.
So when we think about the way that we need to recognize and respond to diversity around the breadth and scope of persons with disability, persons with IDD, we have to think about and always remind ourselves to avoid the tendency to group folks together just because of their IDD status, because they're not homogenous. We have to remember their intersectionality and their membership in other groups. We have to respect, recognize, and respond to the within group differences among persons with IDD, their families and communities. We have to always think about the ways to learn more about the nuances of who these people are, and always understand their experience of intersectionality, their strengths, to try to spot those strengths and their resilience and acknowledge and respond to the diversity within neurodiversity.
So we're going to move now to inclusion. And what does inclusion mean? We know that inclusion means different things to different people and different communities. And it clearly means different things within the IDD space. Typically, when I'm doing this presentation and have more time, I look at the different ways that inclusion may be defined. And looking at that, and I'm going to say the diversity literature that we see, looking at it within the LGBTQI literature that we see, I pulled out disability because as we look at this way in which inclusion is defined, it's distinctively different than what we see inclusion as how inclusion is defined in other settings. And so as we look at this from a disability perspective, it's getting fair treatment, ensuring that things are accessible using universal design, really looking at how we modify systems that will enable people with disabilities to be able to use them in an effective way. And then most importantly, eliminating belief that people with disabilities aren't healthy or less capable of doing things. That's a very unique way of thinking about inclusion versus, say, if we're looking at inclusion solely through HR lens and from a diversity lens.
So when we think about inclusion, thinking about it from a different way. So, not really, when we're not thinking about it historically, being locked out or locked out to come in. And thinking about it also about who has the authority or the right to invite others in, and how did the inviters get in, and who is it that's doing the excluding? Thinking about it from a really important standpoint of it's our responsibility as society members to remove the barriers that uphold exclusion, since none of us have the authority to invite others in. And also recognizing our universal oneness and our interdependence. Inclusion is that we recognize that we are one, even though we are not the same. And so when we think about that, we should also begin to think about belonging and just planting that seed, because we'll get to that a little bit more deeply later.
So Wendy, you can go ahead with that.
Okay. So what will it take for inclusion? So we have to have the capacity and the insight to think about, view, and respond to inclusion, and always looking at it through a cultural lens. And this is one that we can't take off. It's one that we keep on. That we have to have the political will, the expertise, resources to confront and address disparities, disproportionality, and inequities. That we have to reflect on whether inclusion and belonging are the same and what they mean within the IDD space.
So as we think about inclusion, again, it really means that we have to have the tenacity to address some hard things about inclusion. And we have to be able to do that no matter the social and political environment in which we may find ourselves. So that means when we look at true inclusion, we have to be able to confront and address the isms. And we share with you just our way of thinking about these broad range of isms that we see in our society that impact persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, their families, and the communities in which they live. And so overall, these are things that we really need to think about, distinguish, and to be able to find within councils. Wendy.
So again, back to belonging. So if we think about the definitions and frameworks that have been presented so far on inclusion, do you believe that inclusion is the same as belonging? And can individuals be included but not feel that they actually belong? I would hazard a guess to say yes, because often people are included, but they don't always feel that they belong, especially if belonging, if you take this definition, that it's an innate human need for ongoing personal contact, meaningful relationships, and the feeling of being accepted and valued by others. So I could invite you in, but if I invite you in, but you're not really, once you're in your role, your value, if you don't feel valued, if you don't feel like you're truly a part, then that doesn't make you feel like you belong. You're not actually belonging in this space. So let's always keep belonging in mind and strive to not only include, but make sure folks know that they belong.
So let's talk about what is equity and what does it mean in the IDD space. As we think about where we are with the concept, the practice of equity, I would say in the IDD space, we're pretty far behind. When we think about other fields such as health, mental health, and even education, that there's been much more emphasis on defining what equity is and what it looks like and what we need to be able to achieve that. In 2020, in December 2020, I had the privilege of planning the AUCD annual conference. And I chose the theme of equity because I knew that we really needed to recognize it, to be able to create a national agenda in partnership and led by people with disabilities and their families to be able to really address this. And so as we think in this current administration that there's a huge emphasis on equity, we really need to conceptualize, define it in order to go forward. However, before we talk about equity, we definitely have to talk about disparity because basically, I would say disparities are the product of inequity.
So when we think about disparity and we hope to define it, we're talking about difference, not equal, lack of similarity. So we have the cartoon and it's depicting a disparity in height with the tall character and the short character. And disparities in and of themselves can be neutral. Like this is not bad, good or bad that one person's tall, let's say Tawara, and one person's short, let's say Wendy. It's neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a difference.
All right, Wendy, you're making me laugh. So I'm giving you an example of how disparities are defined, again, in the health literature, because they have done so much more than we have in IDD about equity. And so if we think about a disparity as a specific kind of difference, and that those differences are based on social or economic disadvantage, and include the things that you see listed there in bullets, whether it's because of someone's race or because of someone's mental health, because of someone's cognitive, sensory, or physical disability, because of place. These are all the kinds of things that we see, at least in health, that place people at a disadvantage. When?
So when we look at equality versus equity, the literature is telling us a couple of things. That equality is not equal to equity.
And so if we look at a review of the literature, we know that there's not one definition of equity, not one. In my review, and everything could not at all be listed there, I saw equity defined in terms of early childhood, racial equity, I saw health equity, public policy equity, social equity, all of these things. But it was really hard push to find a definition of disability equity. And so, again, this is the work that we need to do in the IDD space.
So if we look at the definitions and what they have in common, we see that equality is treating all people the same regardless of their interests, needs, circumstances, or abilities. But that equity is talking about making sure that people with different levels of support and assistance get really what they need based upon their interests, needs, circumstances, or abilities. So it's sort of tailoring what they get to those needs, circumstances, or abilities. And so we have my favorite graphic, which is the only graphic that I've ever found that actually references a person with disability. And this is really the top portion showing us equality where everyone has a bicycle, but the bottom part is equity because the bicycle is tailored to meet the needs of each person in the graphic, specifically the person with disability having the bicycle that meets her needs because her or their needs as it is tailored because she's now able to use it, be out of the wheelchair and still be mobile on a bicycle.
All right, and so if we borrowed heavily from the health equity literature, I came up with a way of thinking about health equity in the IDD space, and that is that equity in intellectual and developmental disabilities can be defined as the absence of disparities, and these disparities are across systems, and also unjust policies across systems, unjust practices across systems that somehow place individuals with developmental disabilities in their families at an unfair disadvantage. But then at the same time, people who don't have such disabilities and their families have advantages. And so this is a way for us to really begin to think about what is equity. I have some elements of cultural competence and what their implications are for in the IDD space. We simply don't have enough time to go through all of these. We created this so that you could have it as a resource. I will just maybe reference a couple of them that I think is very important. So that we need to be able to accept that some racial, ethnic, and other cultural groups have historical and present-day experiences of bias, of discrimination, of stereotyping, and disparate treatment. And we know that this happens because it's very well documented, whether it's in education, whether it's in health and mental health, or social services. And when we think about this within the lens of equity, these experiences really affect the capacity within those communities to have trust and confidence in our systems of services and supports. So we have to be aware of this and to be able to use this knowledge in order to advance equity. And again, we simply don't have time to go through all of those that are listed here, but they're an excellent resource for the councils.
So we received a few questions from councils to try to respond to, and what we wanted to share back with you, as well as to try to answer 2 of those questions at least, was that you sent us questions and we appreciated all of them. Some of them, most of them, were really focusing on diversity, racial justice, social justice, inclusion, cultural and linguistic competence, and issues related to Black Lives Matter, but not really equity. So what we want to do is take 2 of them that we felt we could use an equity frame to try to respond to, and then share some considerations or some things that you should think about as you are attempting to do the work of your councils. So in particular, there was a question around creating and working with communities, different communities, diverse communities, and creating lasting and meaningful relationships. So, and one of the things that we want to talk about is this idea of lasting and meaningful relationships. So lasting and meaningful relationships takes time and energy and commitment, all of which we know that councils have the capacity to do. It also takes reciprocal relationships. So it's not just the relationship that councils want to have with communities, diverse communities, whether it's LGBTQ+, whether it's racially, ethnically, or culturally diverse communities, but it has to be reciprocal. So we think that you have to work strongly on your community engagement skills, and that you want to be strategic in learning about these approaches. So the literature is replete with different approaches for different communities. So to check that literature out. But also, there's also a lot of information on working with cultural liaisons or cultural brokers that also can be the gateway sometimes to getting into different communities. So that's 1. 2. The other piece is that learning what's happening in different communities, that will give you an entree, see what's going on, as we're hoping that the pandemic is opening up the opportunity to be physically in spaces. Check out the media, check out ethnic media to find out what's happening in communities so that you can physically join. Ensure that you have information and opportunity to share what your DD Council is, what's your purpose, what's your aim, so that as you begin to join, you're telling people who you are, what you stand for, what you do, creating those opportunities for partnerships before you need them, like we say in leadership, that we create the opportunity for partnerships before you need them and build over time. And then also find the ways in which what you might like to do would resonate with those partners, taking the time to build the trust. And then when you're wanting to work together, you have the basis for that extensive long-term relationship. Because when you want to just do one activity or the other, that's not the basis of a long-term relationship. So build a relationship, nourish it, and always that opportunity for the reciprocal learning, and you'll find there's your opportunity for that long-term meaningful relationship.
Thank you, Wendy. Just want to add a couple of things. I also encourage councils to think about their values for community engagement and have you define values. On our website, at least on the National Center website, we have 4 values around engaging communities. That communities determine their own needs, that community members are full partners in decision making, that communities should economically benefit from collaboration, and that community engagement should really result in the transfer, I'm going to say reciprocal transfer of knowledge and skills among all of the partners. So again, this engaging communities is not an event. Engaging communities is not a specific project. It is really how councils live within the geographic space within their state or territory. Oh, I have to leave that here. So I get the second question, and the second question really looked at the notion of being able to expand on notions of diversity rather than simply looking at diversity from a standpoint of Black Lives Matter. Then we also have the acronym BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. On a note, there are some people who absolutely resent being referred to as BIPOC because they don't want you to reduce who they are to an acronym. But with that said, and we're looking at not diverting energy away from the importance of focusing on these issues. How do you do this? So I think there are a couple things if we use an equity lens. First is that if we acknowledge, as we did before, that all persons, including those with disabilities and their families, have multiple cultural identities as a starting point, we don't have to really talk about coming back to other types of diversity, because we are acknowledging the multiple cultural identities that everybody brings to the table. And we're also recognizing the experience of intersectionality that's imposed by society on different groups. We also have to be cognizant and responsive to the kind of environment in which we're living. We can think about our current social cultural environment in the United States, and particularly over the last 18 months or so, because of the pandemic and also because of the racial strife and unrest that we've seen in this country. So it's not unusual for there to be an emphasis on a particular community, given what's happening within our country. And so that, again, if it's not as if I'm going to say Black communities, because that was referenced, African-American communities, it's not as if all people within those communities are the same, and it's not as if they don't have multiple cultural identities, including members with disabilities. And so we really have to go back and think about those definitions that we shared with you earlier, so that we are indeed cognizant of that diversity is much more than race and ethnicity. And lastly, if we're looking at it through equity perspective, is that equity means we are concerned about all. However, just as we saw with the graphic that Wendy had, that sometimes there has to be more resources, more attention devoted to specific communities or groups because they have experience in equities. And so it's not as if we're leaving out other groups. It really is about how do we ensure that we have attention, resources, and a focus on those communities that have been underserved and appropriately served or not served at all.
So we wanted to leave you with a few questions to ponder or to consider. So as you seek to enter into communities or to partner with communities, think about whether or not communities have benefited more than others from council policies, practices, activities, or grants. And if so, which communities? And which communities have not benefited? And how can your council address these disparities? Because when we're really thinking about equity, we're really thinking about and using that equity lens to really hone in on whether or not we have inadvertently made opportunities or created opportunities where one community or another has benefited more than another. Do any of your council's policies or practices result in a negative impact on some communities or populations? And if so, how can the council begin to address this form from an equity perspective? So it's sort of doing a deep dive, taking a look at what's happened and resolving to make change.
There are a few other questions that we have. How can your council ensure the equitable engagement of communities in all council activities that are required by the DD Act? So again, these are things for you to contemplate. In what ways has your council begun to consider equity, again, assuming that you've defined it, in its existing 5-year plan? And lastly, how will your council begin to address equity in its budget and priorities going forward? So we know that defining and reaching consensus on what equity is, as we saw in the poll, particularly in the IDD space, is a work in progress that is under development. And we know that ITAC and other members within, I'm going to say the ACL, OIDD funded programs are all taking this journey together. And we need to pull together to be able to do this work, to share what we've learned, and to promote equity as a routine part of what we do each and every day. So thank you, and I will stop share at this time.
Thank you so much. I feel like if we were in person tomorrow and Wendy, we would have applause. It's something that you miss when you're in person. So thank you so much. That was beautiful. And like I said before, we do have the resources on the itachelp.org website. We have the PDF presentation. And as Tuara noted, there are so many resources out there in this area, and a lot of them are on our DICLC page. One of them on the DICLC page is actually our newest resource, and we're gonna transition to that now. So thank you again, Tuara and Wendy. So for this year, we had an emerging practices group on diversity, inclusion, and cultural and linguistic competence. We also had one on systems change. So I want to turn this presentation now over to Kyoko Koko from New Jersey, from the New Jersey Developmental Disabilities Council. And she is going to share just a really quick overview of the new resource so that councils can get familiar with what it includes. So Kyoko?
Hello everyone, my name is Kyoko from New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities. Next slide, please. So I'd like to quickly introduce the new resources. So DD Council required to report its overall efforts to support individuals with developmental disabilities and families from diverse backgrounds through its state plan activities. So to increase the capacity of councils to support this work, an emerging practices group on DICLC was formed, and there are 10 members. Charles from Mississippi, Christine and Marilu from Idaho, Jean and Elizabeth from Alaska, Erica from Arizona, Arlene from South Dakota, Jerma from Guam, Jackie from New York, and myself. And thank you all to the Emergency Practices Group members for your input on this new resource. So this is exciting. This resource is a result of a diverse group of subject experts, council staff, and members working together to compile a list of promising practices to be considered by all councils. Next slide, please. So I'd like to go over quickly about the content sections, background and purpose. How can this resource help your DD council? How can this resource be used? Definitions and terms that includes DD Act definitions related to DICLC, and also other key terms related to DICLC. And this definitions and terms section begins with DD Act definitions related to diversity, inclusion, and cultural and linguistic competence. And it also includes other key terms that can support councils in their overall efforts to increase the use of DICLC in all aspects of council work. There's also video that explains culture in plain language from A Tuesday with Liz, interview with Tamara, and many other links and articles on intersectionality, gender identity, sexual orientation, and more. Next slide, please. And this resource also includes top 10 promising practices on DICLC used by other DD councils, tips for reporting on cultural diversity in the program performance report, PPR, summary, and also additional resources and information. So this section is not a full list of resources on this particular topic, but it is a list that complements the top 10 practices and opportunities to learn more about the topic of diversity, inclusion, and cultural and linguistic competence. Next slide, please. So to access this new resource, visit itachelp.org. And if you have any questions about the resources, please contact Angela. She's amazing. And her email address is listed there.
Thank you so much, Kyoko, for going through that with us. And hopefully it inspires all the councils to learn more about the resource and try some of the strategies, use it for the definitions and the terms, and then let us know what you think. So again, these are your resources, developed by your peers and subject matter experts, and we're really anxious to have you try it and let us know what your thoughts are. So thank you, Kyoko. So we also want to try to help everyone kind of make a connection to why we chose the practices that we chose and why we chose the content that we did for this resource. And so to make that connection, I'd like to introduce Jackie Hayes from the New York Developmental Disabilities Planning Council and Jermaine Alerta from Guam, the Executive Director from the Guam Council, to talk a little bit about how they used the DICLC tip number 6. Engaging diverse communities. Again, this is from your new resource, and again, we just want to help make the connection between what you read on the paper and then how that's actually applied to the council work. So Jackie?
Great, thank you so much. So as Angela mentioned, I'm Jackie Hayes. I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Program Specialist at the New York DD Council, and today I really want to talk about promising practice number 6, highlighted in the guide that Kyoko introduced in the beginning. And also I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge all the support that we've gotten from the Georgetown National Center for Cultural Competence, specifically Wendy Jones and Tora Good. And so if you hear some themes come out that kind of overlap with some of their presentation, it's definitely because of assistance and guidance that we've gotten from them. So as a bit of background, we began engaging diverse communities at the start of our last 5-year state plan in 2016, really after reflecting on who we were getting input from. And when looking at that kind of, demographic profile of who we were receiving input on our last state plan, it really, we really learned that it was mostly parents, so not people with developmental disabilities, mostly female, and mostly people of white or Caucasian descent. And so, we want that input, but we also want input from the diversity of New York State. And it was clear to us that our input that we were receiving really didn't reflect the diversity of New York State. And of course, that is a problem because how we identify our priorities, the needs that we see, issues, and how we think about solutions is really based on input we receive. And, we know that where we turn our attention and our resources is directly connected to who we're hearing from. So that's why that input is so vital and so important that we get diverse input. So you can go to the next slide. And we've continued that kind of practice, but I kind of want to highlight some things that we've learned along the way in engaging diverse communities. So, we started by reaching out to community-based organizations, really that idea of wanting to connect to cultural brokers. And so we reached out to the Chinese American Planning Council in our state, ASHO, a community-based organization that serves the Bangladeshi community, Arab American Association, Synergia, who serves Spanish speakers primarily, to name a few of the organizations that we partnered with and, continue to partner with and really wanted to build relationships with. So I think what was key for the first meeting, but also ongoing meetings, is to really ask community-based organizations where the meetings should be held, really going to the community, going to spaces that are trusted, when the meeting should be held. It seems kind of simple, but it's really important too to be at a time that's convenient. How to format the meeting, including even some of the issues that people want discussed. So when we did a meeting with CETA, which is a Korean American group, they said, we'd like to do a focus group with you, but, our community really cares about employment, and we really want to talk with someone from Access VR, which is the vocational rehab services agency in our state. So could you invite someone from Access VR so they can hear our parents' concerns as well? So we made sure that that was part of the focus group. And then accessibility, really offering to translate materials and provide an interpreter. I've seen other organizations ask the community-based organization to provide an interpreter. And I really think it's on us, to have that responsibility to provide that interpreter. Certainly if an organization says they prefer to, that's different, but I think really seeing it as our responsibility. I think in terms of engagement, it's really important to be open and candid. That's kind of a tenet of any good relationship. But even, at the beginning, we really were upfront with, we haven't done this outreach before, or maybe we've never connected with your community. And I think starting from that place of just saying, here's where we're at, is really important to building trust in communities. I think also it's really important to resist forming biases. I think it's natural for humans to do that, to kind of start to be like, oh, it looks like, everyone in this room is mothers, or, from this specific neighborhood. But as your mind is doing that, I think it's really important to challenge it, hold it lightly, and just continually be open to changing your understanding, to make sure, that those biases don't get formed in a hard and firm sort of way. I think, one of the things that I kind of highlighted was a quote from an article that I think Tuara had shared with us, about cultural humility. And I really think it's a good concept to ground any sort of engagement, really engaging in ongoing self-evaluation and critique, trying to address historic power imbalances that have been, again, historic but ongoing, and have, persisted until today. And I want to highlight one part of that kind of quote about developing mutually beneficial partnerships. So going on to the next slide. So one of the things, as we were building a relationship with the Chinese American community, in partnership with those organizations, they really said to us that it would be great to have a rep from the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, so the DD service agency in our state, come and hear concerns from the community. And so, as part of our relationship, we reached out to OPWDD, and they said that they'd be willing to have their deputy commissioner come down. And the CBO that we were working with, the Chinese American Planning Council and AFDN, they actually organized the outreach for the event, and close to 200 Chinese American parents came, really to, say for the first time, the deputy commissioner is coming to our community in New York City to present at it was the Charles B. Wong Community Center, and hear our concerns. And so I think, that kind of mutual reciprocity, like we are, getting so much from the input from these families. And when they kind of come and say, we want this specific thing, like an OPWDD rep to come to really follow through to make sure that the community is also getting something out of the partnership with us. And so, I know I'm probably short on time, so I'll just go to the last slide, to also just really emphasize that it's really important to act on the input that we receive from communities. And so here's a few initiatives that we engaged in as a result of the input that we received. We knew that, we developed a language access plan, and we also piloted a grant, the Ramirez June Developmental Disabilities Navigator grant, in partnership with our DD network and the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. They also made a number of improvements and piloted some projects directly as a result of that input. So I think it's really, really important, again, in that building trust to act on input and really in order to show that you're listening, but also responding to needs that are being raised. And so what I'll do is I'll also just, you know, one of the things that we developed was report a community needs assessment, because we really wanted to document the input that we were getting for communities and really have a place that we could go back and kind of see, are we following through on the input that we got? And so I'll just post a link to that community needs assessment in case others want to read it and refer to it in the future. But thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about New York and our experience, and I will pass it to Jermaine.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you for doing the hard part for me. You laid the groundwork, and I'm just here to present an example of how the Guam DD Council engage diverse communities to help some of the work we do here on Guam. I first want to say my name is Jermaine Alerta. I'm the Executive Director here in the Guam DD Council. Good morning from Guam, the other side of the world. It is really, really early in the morning, but I'm very honored to be asked to help present here. I want to thank NACDD and ITAC. I especially want to thank Angela for all the guidance and all the leadership she's been giving our group over these past few months. So for tip number 6, which is engaging diverse communities, here on Guam, we actually, I like to joke that it seems that all the work we do engages diverse communities because our island, our territory, has so many people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, just different groups here on Guam, and it doesn't seem like we're going out of our way to address diversity because of the population we have, the mixed population. But in trying to find examples, I wanted to present how the Guam DD Council used one of our council members in terms of helping with the development of our state plan. All the DD councils know how difficult maybe this past state plan, this is my first state plan as executive director, and it was a little bit more difficult because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we had to find, other ways to reach out to the community for their input. So one of our members, Augusta Francis, she's of Chuukese descent. And on Guam, there's a large population of citizens from the Federated States of Micronesia that are part of our population. The Federated States of Micronesia, a small group of islands made up of 4 different states, Yap, Kosrae, Pohnpei, and Chuuk. They a lot of them call Guam home. And when we were developing our state plan, we were trying to get input, more input from the community, and we did an online survey as part of our outreach so that people can more conveniently provide their input onto shaping the direction that our DD Council is going to go with our new 5-year state plan. And as we were doing it, we were getting a lot of responses online. But what we were missing was input from the FSM community. And it was showing we were getting like 300 responses, but maybe only 2 came from people who identified themselves as FSM or citizens of the other islands in the Micronesia region. So we tapped on Augusta Francis, who is the mother of an individual with Down syndrome. And she is one of our newer members, just appointed in 2019. And we asked her, are you able to help us reach out to your community? Because one of the things we encountered was that a lot of people didn't have access to the internet, or they were able to provide input on our online survey. So she agreed to come into our office. And at that time, there was a lot of government operations were suspended, or we were working remotely. But she agreed to come in, and she took about 100 paper surveys, and she agreed to pass them out to her friends and family and neighbors within the Chuukese community to get some input, because she had mentioned to us that there are a lot of families who who do have members of their immediate families with disabilities, but they don't usually come forward. And that's just a cultural thing in our area, in our region of the world. And I'm sure it's something that's similar in other places. But so she was able to go out there and hand paper surveys out. And of the 500 total responses we received for in regards to input for our state plan development survey, she brought back 80 or around 80 from members of the Chukis community. And a lot of the issues that they brought up were issues that were shared by a lot of people here in Guam, but it was just refreshing to have input from that smaller ethnic population within our overall island population. So it's important to find out the networking that your DD Council members have. And that's a good place to start, because here in Guam, we have so many different ethnic groups and they have their own community organizations, right? But you need to be able to pinpoint a key leader or a key person within those organizations that can act as your liaison or your middle person, so that it's a way to tap and become more comfortable and establish a better relationship with those organizations. So we looked at our council member from who's from of Chukis descent, and she was that liaison for us. And out of the 500 responses, we got 80, like I said, from the Chukis community. And that was a big part of helping us understand some of the issues they're facing as a community, as an underserved and a very, very minority section of our population. And we were able to get their input. And I don't think in the past it's been that much of a turnover or getting input from that many people. So tap first your DD Council members and see how their partnerships and their networking can help the DD Councils reach out to communities or parts of the community that have been underrepresented in the past. Thank you so much for allowing me to share an example from Guam. And again, I appreciate NACDD and ITAC for allowing us to put together this group and provide some input to help other councils throughout the nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jermaine and Jackie, for sharing these examples and helping us connect to the resource. I want to, it's just so much great information. So I want to quickly turn it over to Christine Pisani as well, Executive Director of the Idaho Council. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you, Angela. I'm gonna try to speak quickly because I know we have another segment coming up. The example that I'm going to give to you will highlight 3 tips within the resource guide of promising practices. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our Partners in Policymaking program, which we've sponsored since 1996. And we intentionally recruited Spanish-speaking families and individuals for the last 2 classes of our Partners program. And we provided interpretation and we translated the materials. But I quickly recognized that that didn't necessarily make it a culturally or linguistically competent program. So some of the steps that we've taken since that recognition, we reached out to the Utah DD Council and the Utah Center for Persons with Disabilities because they have a high Mexican American community like Idaho. And I asked, would you be willing to collaborate with us to develop a leadership program that would meet the learning and leadership needs of the Mexican American communities in our states? And fortunately, Matt and Libby agreed, and we've been meeting monthly to try and develop that with the inclusion of Mexican Americans to create that learning. The second thing we did was to hire a partners coordinator with a specific intention of hiring from the Mexican American community here in Idaho. And he will coordinate this new leadership program for Spanish-speaking individuals in Utah and in Idaho. And our goal with the Utah Partners Program is to host a leadership development program to meet this specific culture's leadership needs in 2023. The example that I share highlights number 1, the first promising practice, staffing the DICLC work. And number 6, engaging diverse communities, because we've spent a lot of time working with this community just to learn and build relationship to the community. And number 6, which is number 7, supporting diversity in self-advocacy groups and council advocacy activities. So those are the examples. That's the example that I share with you to kind of put into practice how one council is using these practices that I have sincere gratitude for. Tawara, Vivian Jackson have had a lot of influence in our state. And I also want to give lots of recognition to Mary Lou Moreno. She was part of the resource guide and she's a teacher for me every day. She doesn't give herself nearly enough credit, and I have a lot of gratitude for Mary Lou. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you, Christine, and I agree on the Mary Lou comment as well. She's amazing. Thank you all for sharing those connections to the resource. We do have a little bit of time. I don't know if we could open it up if anyone has a quick question. I believe Tawara and Wendy are still on, or if anyone has a quick question for our DICLC Emerging Practices group. We will do our best to get those answered. And then, of course, like I said, we can always follow up with you. So I'm just going to open that up since we have a few minutes. Let us know if you have anything. You can unmute as Jen shared with us, or you have the Q&A box. Thanks again to the Emerging Practices group. They've just been such a pleasure to work with. So, and the process has been amazing. But any questions from the group? Okay, I don't think I see any. But again, please keep an eye out for our follow-up meeting, the peer-to-peer exchange that we will plan so that we can continue the conversation in smaller groups, which makes, I think, asking questions and getting answers a little easier. So again, thank you to Tawara and Wendy, all the amazing Emerging Practices group members. And I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to the Emerging Practices group on systems change. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Angela, and thank you so much to Tawara and Wendy. I know as you guys were listening to all of that great information, I know I was writing a bunch of notes. I know we have access to the PowerPoint, but it really got me to thinking, and I'm sure I heard your wheels turning in your heads as well. So now we'd like to just shift a little bit, and we have this portion of the session is going to really present some information about the purpose of the systems change emerging practices groups, the practices that might be of help to you, including a training module and some resources and tools, which really does sum up all of the work these amazing groups, the members of these groups have done since January of this year. Members of both of the groups will share their information, so I'd like to turn it over to Jessica Pigeon.
Thanks, Cheryl. We're so excited to share about about the work that we've been doing. Next slide, please. And the work that we've done over the last year with the 2 work groups to help councils think about and implement activities in systems change. In this afternoon session, we'll provide an overview of the work groups themselves, including the participants and the purpose of the work groups. We'll then show some sections of a systems change training module, which Cheryl just mentioned, that's been developed for councils, as well as some supplemental materials, some additional materials to go along with the modules, all of which are meant to support councils to better understand systems change and identify strategies for systems change work. Lastly, we'll provide information throughout the presentation on where and how you can access the resources and ways for you to provide feedback on the tools that have been created. Next slide, please. So before diving into the tools, we want to recognize and thank those who have participated in the 2 work groups over the last year. So thank you all for your time, energy, efforts, and your continued participation, because we see this as an ongoing process. So you can see those who have participated on the slide there. Last fall, ITAC did a call for people who were interested in joining the systems change group, and luckily a lot of really amazing council staff and members volunteered to join. It was especially exciting and helpful, in my opinion, and I think everybody else's, for the process to have so many members that represent such diverse backgrounds. So we have members on the work group who are council members. We have different staff members. We have staff that are from big allotment states, small and medium allotment states. We have staff that are new to councils, some who have been around a little bit longer, staff who have different jobs at the council, so some directors, some trainers, and some planning and policy staff. And then we have people who have a lot of systems change experience and those with a little bit less experience. So the diversity in the membership of the 2 groups really helped provide an opportunity for rich discussions from a variety of different viewpoints, leading to what we believe are some great tools for all of the councils, regardless of your makeup, for you to be utilizing, which will be discussed in the following slides, as Cheryl has mentioned. Next slide, and I'll pass it to Wanda.
Okay, thanks so much, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. In terms of the purpose and overview of the 2 groups that Jessica mentioned, let me just start by reminding us that each year we're asked to fill out an assessment to identify our technical assistance needs. And so this past year, when the information was submitted to help ITAC staff plan, develop, and implement TA activities for the year, there was a question about what council staff and members needed to support them to facilitate systems change. How do we facilitate systems change? So that then had ITAC to embark on a deep dive with the 2 groups that Jessica just mentioned. So basically, also in that assessment, we learned that council members and staff and executive directors needed training and information to discuss systems change in an easier to understand way, and also information about strategies to use when we're addressing a long-term systems change issue, and then also information about allowable systems change activities. So a lot of questions around that topic. ITAC staff, with the support then of the Office of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, created the work groups that you saw to exchange ideas about systems change and develop some suggested practices that all of us could use. And so that's how the 2 groups came about. We met monthly, discussing not only concepts of systems change, what is it, but also ideas about efforts and how to maybe resources that could help us create and strategies to work on systems change efforts. So that is a little background in who's been involved and what we've done, how we came together. And at this point, we'll move to the next slide, and I will hand over to Genesee to talk a little bit about practice group number 1.
Thank you, Wanda. So our group used the technical assistance strategy of knowledge development to create a training module on systems change. So this module provides basic information on systems change, and this is designed for council members and staff. So the full training module includes quiz questions to measure understanding. We also have full presenter notes with suggestions for participant engagement activities. So a really robust training module has been provided. And during this presentation, we're going to share a few slides from the model to give you an idea about what the content looks like. But we'll also just kind of go over quickly what kind of the whole scope of that training module is. Next slide, please. So the training module starts with, our simple hypothetically question, what is systems change and why is it needed? And what is a system? So kind of reviewing these concepts that I think we often come into thinking that we're all on the same page about, and we may or may not be. So a good point for clarification to make sure that we're capturing different experience and knowledge levels about systems change. Following those sections, information about what councils can do with to advance their systems change. And we also have a bunch of different examples that are real life examples of what councils have done in the past few years to with their systems change efforts. And the module ends with information on the amount of time people have, about the amount of time sometimes systems change efforts can take. And so as you can imagine, there's a big range in there. And so that's an overview of kind of our key points of the training module that's online. And you'll be hearing a little bit more next about some deeper dive on these content areas. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Luz now.
Hello, I'm Luz Zenaida from DC Council. Next slide, please. The next few slides are from the training module. The training module begins with information about what is system change. Our group feels that it's important to recognize that systems do not do things, rather than people working in the system do things. On this slide, you will see wording offer focus on people, the need to work together, a connection to change, and resulting in positive outcome and impact for people with DD and their families. What is system change? So system change is about people working together to change policy, programs, and resources. This change will cause positive and helpful outcome for people with mental disability and their family. So this reminds me, the word is say, nothing about us without us, for said advocate. It's the same concept. Council want to work with people working in the system to make positive change together. Next slide. We also think that it's important to talk about what a system is, or organized collection of parts that work together to accomplish something. For example, as part of the system may be application process, LBGD process, criteria for services process, individualized planning process, or training and education about best practice for providing, among others. A system can be small and big, style-wide, or community-based. Again, we want to make sure to highlight that it's people working in the system provide something to people, and they use law, rules, policy, produce to do the work. Rebecca?
Hi, I'm Rebecca from the Ohio DD Council. So this module includes information about what councils can do. As you know, the DD Act provides money to DD councils to engage in advocacy, capacity building, and systems change. So systems change is expected. The second practice group developed resources and tools about strategies to use. And the first practice group did not duplicate that work, but we wanted to include information about the DD Act expectation and let councils know the strategies and conduct activities to support the systems change work. Next slide. The training module also includes examples. The examples were included to give people an idea about how something happens. On this slide, we wanted to show different ways DD councils do systems work. Councils collaborate with other groups interested in the same issue. They form strategic partnerships with other people and groups. Councils provide money for grants and consultants to work on the issue. and councils assign staff to participate in the work. Staff participate in different ways. Some examples are staff could organize meetings, lead efforts, participate on work groups or interagency groups, or serve as liaisons to a larger group, conduct research, lead or conduct advocacy efforts with state legislators or executive agencies, and participate in communities of practice. Wanda?
Okay, next slide. Sorry for the delay there. Okay, so our groups wanted to provide an example of both what we consider a big system change initiative and then a smaller systems change initiative, just to show the different kinds of systems change projects that we might engage in. So with a big system example, the topic here is childcare. And this is an actual initiative that one of our state councils worked on. So the problem was identified as lack of access to accessible, inclusive childcare. So the council wanted to change several things. First of all, they wanted to change the way that people who were working in the childcare system were thinking. So they began by providing training on the Americans with Disabilities Act, training on best practices for including children with disabilities into their programs. But the council also wanted to go a little bit deeper and change policy and regulations to require childcare providers receive annual ADA and inclusion training, so that it would be a requirement of policy change. In describing the impact, the council said that the impact for people with developmental disabilities and their families would be increased access to childcare services, and that those would be accessible, and children with developmental disabilities and their families would have positive childcare experiences. So then there were also outcomes for people who were working in the system. For this target group, standard training requirements were set for the providers, and reduced complaints about childcare providers discriminating against families who had children with disabilities and were requesting service, and increased confidence among childcare workers to provide inclusive environments for children with disabilities and their families were outcomes. So look again, when we look at this diagram, we want to look at the problem, beginning with the problem, to see, is there a connection between the problem and the impact? Well, I think it's clear to see that there is a connection to improved access and accessible inclusive childcare. So at this point, I'm going to hand off to Nicole to talk about a smaller system initiative.
Next slide, please. Okay, I'm Nicole and I'm from Kentucky. And as we noted earlier, we wanted to include different examples in the training module. So this is an example, as was stated, of a small system. So the system here is a fitness center. The problem was that the community-based fitness center programs, they lack knowledge about how to make their services and programs work for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we wanted their thinking to be changed. So the council provided training and education about the capabilities of people with disabilities, the ADA, and about accessible equipment that was available, communication, and adapting fitness programs for people who have disabilities. So they also wanted the policy to be changed. Through the council's efforts, the Fitness Center adopted a new policy, and they provide annual training now and education to new and existing fitness center staff. So the impact for the people who have disabilities and their families was increased access to the community-based fitness program. They had increases in healthy lifestyles, meaning that people with disabilities said that they were more active, they lost weight, and they were more aware about food and calories. They were healthier overall, which of course is huge impact. And then they also reported increased confidence, and they felt better about themselves. So we all know how important that is in our day-to-day lives. The outcomes for people working in the small systems were that they had more knowledge about how to adapt their fitness programs for all people in the community. They were more confident and welcoming and providing their services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide, please. So we want to invite you guys to use the training module when the final draft comes out. We want you to be able to use that with council staff and council members, and then also provide feedback about how the training module can be made better. So we would like to know if this information increased understanding about systems change, why systems change is needed, and the different types of systems, and did the examples help a person see the way that systems change happens as they went through the training module. We also want to know if we missed something. Is there something else that you guys see that should be included that we didn't include? And is there anything in the module that was not helpful or that could be left out? So of course we want your suggestions for making it better, and any other comments that you would like to offer. I'm sure Cheryl would love to have those. And if there's anything about systems change that you want to know more about that was not covered, please let her know that as well. So by the end of August, Cheryl would like to be able to compile all the feedback and include it in the training module before it is posted on the ITAC website. So I also want to thank Cheryl just for being such a great group leader for us. I appreciate all of your effort and your patience with us as well. So I will turn it over then to group 2 with Morgan.
All right, thanks, Nicole. Can I get the next slide, please? All right, you just heard about the purpose of the systems change practice groups. So now we'll discuss what constitutes a systems change effort and the strategies and types of change. Next slide, please. All right. Our focus was to see if we could develop a tool that would help councils identify something as a systems change effort. So you can see that on the screen there. Next slide, please. All right. As far as our preparation, we wanted to provide some information about strategies to use when doing systems change work that are also supported by the DD Act. And we wanted to provide some information about the types of change often associated with systems change efforts. Next slide, please. And I will pass it on to Vandella.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So to prepare for our monthly discussions, we reviewed a variety of information and resources on the topic of systems change. We reviewed systems change information specific to DD Council, such as the Route to Success Model, NACDD Systems Change Concept Paper from 2011, and of course we looked at the federal law and regulations. Then we looked at systems change from a social problem, a more general systems change perspective. And some of the information that we reviewed included Ashaka's systems change crash course, and that helped us to find ways to think more innovatively about our approach to social change. We also looked at the able change process, and that was designed by Michigan's own Dr. Penny Foster Fishman. She was one of the co-designers, and she looks at communities, how to help communities to more effectively address complex social problems. and to achieve transformative community change. And just as a side note, Dr. Foster Fishman, she worked with our own council several years ago to do an external review of our work. We also looked at learning for action, evaluating systems change in a human services systems context. And then we looked at the National Center for Cultural Competence resource guide to respond to disparities for people with IDD in developing system strategies for systems change. And then finally, we looked at the McKinsey 7S framework, and I can't remember all the S's, but I do know that strategy, systems, skill, and staff are part of those. So, and that's all encompassing in what we're working with as well. So the purpose of reviewing the general systems change information and DD-specific systems change information was to see how the information aligned and where improvements could be made on existing information for councils, staff, and for members. Next slide, please. So what we found through the information review was that systems change for developmental disabilities specific issues did not differ much from general systems change models, and the information again was about the same. We found that we can simplify the way we present information and talk about systems change. And we also found that keeping the focus on people working in the systems and people using policies, regulations, instructions, and other things to do the work helps to identify areas where change can be made that is helpful to people with IDD. And we found that changing the way people think about something is very important. Next slide, please. So we thought it might be helpful to share the point of view we use to create these resources. We agreed that systems can be small, big, statewide, community-based, one agency or organization. And as you heard, that viewpoint aligns with the information that Group 1 just presented. And we also agreed that systems can be disability specific or general. And that also aligns with Group 1's information. We agreed that systems change work, excuse me, systems change work call for council to be flexible and nimble throughout the effort. Sometimes the best plans need to be adjusted, and those adjustments happen for a variety of reasons, but flexibility is key, meaning that we really need to be able to quickly understand the situation and act. And strategies and activities for some systems change effort can change. And it means that sometimes you'll need to add a strategy or change a strategy, add or change any activities as the work is happening. And these decisions are best determined by the council. So I'll turn it over to Beth.
So the next slide, please. So now we will look at the decision tree tool. And you're probably wondering, when would you be using this tool and when would it be helpful? So we're really proposing three ways that you might use it. One is when you are planning an initiative at the start, and it's hard to tell if this could be a systems change effort or not. Or when you may want to double check yourself on things you already classified as a systems change effort. As you know, there's several places that council staff would identify something as systems change effort in the federal reports, and OIDD performance measures for systems change efforts can be identified. The second way you may want to use this tool is when council staff is reviewing project reports and they may see things that might be classified as a systems change effort and want to verify. And the third way to use this tool could be when educating staff and council members about the systems change process. On the next slide,
we'll show you our approach to develop a decision tree model. So here you will see the reference to the final rule definition of systems change from the DD Act, and that has served as the foundation for this tool. So moving from left to right, you'll note that we started with identifying the problem or the barrier that the council is trying to solve. And then we move forward to determine if the problem or barrier is linked to the availability of services or supports, the design of services or supports, or the delivery of services or supports. And so I want to take a moment just to review those three terms. Availability means that services are available, are they, or do you have to wait for services or supports? Or is it the amount of money to provide services, the number of services a person with ID or DD needs, are those available? In terms of design, this refers to the way people working in a system organize the services and supports. The design includes planning to provide services and supports, how those services and supports are provided to people, how the information about services and supports is provided to people, and the way people working in the systems think about working with and providing those services to people. Delivery refers to the way services and supports are provided. This includes the where, when, and how. And it also includes best practices and promising practices when providing or delivering those services. Things like individualized, being person-centered practices, and whether the support has actually increased self-determination. So if you can link your problem to one of these, then you will continue. And if you find that the work cannot be classified as a systems change effort under these terms, you would stop this process. However, you may want to explore your objective and see how that issue could be supported in your state plan in other areas other than systems change. If you answered yes to this section, you would want to think about how the council would address the problem, what strategies you would use to make change. So here you will see the broad strategies of demonstration projects, capacity building, knowledge development, awareness and action, and building community and connections. And we'll talk about these more in just a bit. Following the how item, you will want to think about the impacts you expect for people with developmental disabilities and their families if you are successful in solving the problem. How would the changes create positive and meaningful outcomes for people with DD and their families? And finally, you would want to think about the effort. Do you want your changes to be sustained, meaning that they're able to be maintained after your work ends? Do you want your changes to be transferred, meaning that the changes would work in other places? Or would these changes be replicated, meaning that it could be copied in other places, or it could be a combination of all of them? So next, let's look at an example. As you heard from group one, we used a variety of examples from councils, and we're going to continue with our child care example. The problem or barrier was that families of children with developmental disabilities do not have access to inclusive, high-quality child care. So the problem was linked to the availability of child care, that's the service or support, the design of the child care services, and the delivery of the child care services. So because the council could answer yes to those items, they moved into the how question. And the council thought about what they would do to address the problem. So they wanted to change thinking through training. They wanted to change the policies and regulations. They wanted to change the expectations for families, engage and support families, and also support child care providers. The council used the strategies tool and found the things they wanted to do were supported by the following strategies: capacity building, knowledge development, awareness and action, and building community and connections. The council also thought about the impact these changes would have on children with DD and their families. So they expected that more children with DD would have access to inclusive, high-quality child care. They expected more child care settings would be accessible so that all children could learn and play together. and they expected less discrimination complaints related to accessibility and access. The council also expected the systems change efforts would be sustained through regulation and policy changes and transferred and replicated. This effort was focused on licensed child care providers, so these changes could be transferred to other child care providers and replicated in different settings where care is provided. I will now turn this over to Cheryl for some additional strategies.
Thanks. Next, we want to share the resources Group 2 created to help councils identify strategies that could be used in systems change efforts with a crosswalk of sorts to the DD Act allowable activities. And then we're going to follow that with a review of the resource that provides councils with information about types of change and examples of change. Next slide. The strategies resource can be used in 3 primary ways. The first one is when identifying ways to address a problem or barrier. The second way is at the end of the year when you are assessing progress on your state plan and deciding about the effectiveness of how you used a strategy and how effective it was, and then also to use when exploring additional strategies or maybe to make changes to the current strategies. The third way is as a training and education resource to help council staff and council members increase understanding about strategies to use in systems change effort and also how that strategy is supported by the DD Act. Next slide. I know this is small, but here is a snapshot of the strategies resource. It's already posted to the itachelp.org website, so you can download it, use it, but you'll see the resource is organized into columns. Column 1 reflects the strategy, and these are the broad strategies you've been seeing in the decision tree model: demonstration projects, capacity building, knowledge development, awareness and action, and building community and connections. The second column, it provides you very bulleted information about the strategy. For example, knowledge development might include things like collecting data, doing research, learning about something, developing new or improved ways to provide services, or develop innovative ideas. And the third column is from the DD Act activities part of the law. And so these are correlated with the activities. And so these are activities under the DD Act. You'll see it's activities for state plan implementation. So next, we want to look at an example of how the resource was used. So again, we're using our child care example using the strategy resource. In the box on the far left, you will see what the council wanted to do to address the problem. By now, you can probably recite what the council wanted to do to improve access to inclusive, high-quality child care. Again, they wanted to change child care provider thinking. They wanted to change policies and regulations, change expectations for families about inclusive child care, increase engagement of and support to families, and increase the support that was being provided to child care providers about how to actually do inclusive child care. And then in the middle column, this shows how column 1 of the resource tool could be used. And so using column 1, they identified their broad strategies of capacity building, knowledge development, awareness and action, and building community and connection. And these would be their broad strategies. Then, using the third column in the tool, they wanted to be able to help staff and members see how the DD Act supported the strategies and what activities were allowable. That was one of the identified needs, that people needed to know what was okay and allowable under the DD Act. And so you can see this crosswalk for our major strategies. So the DD Act supports training, technical assistance, supporting and educating communities, and all of the other things listed here. And then, just as a reminder, the DD Act provides detailed information about each activity, state plan activity, that could be also be some additional helpful information. Next slide. So our final resource for Group 2 describes the different types of change that is associated with systems change efforts. The focus of this particular document was on the type of change that a council might be considering to impact a problem. Again, we came up with 3 primary ways you could use the resource. One was at the beginning of a systems change effort or during the planning process to identify activities. And you could also project your expected outcomes and performance measures for the type of change. Secondly, you could use it at the end of the year when you are assessing progress towards the change, that wonderful opportunity to write and submit your program performance report. Or you can use it when you're exploring other types of change that Vendela mentioned, the need to be nimble and flexible. You might use this to identify other ways to address the problem. And finally, you can use this as a training and education activity with staff and members to help them see what types of change with corresponding activities could impact a problem the council is trying to address. Next slide. And this is my last one. So here's a snapshot of the systems, of the type of change resource. Again, this is already posted to the itachelp.org website, so you can download it. The resource is organized into columns, much like the strategies resource. Column 1 shows the type of change. So you'll see things like policy and program changes, service design and delivery changes, infrastructure changes, attitudes, experience, and expectations of people, and engagement and support of people and their families. The second column describes what the type of change means. And then the third column is shows some activities that the councils may consider as you are using or trying to affect some or do some work under the types of change. So next we want to look at it at an example of how the resource was used, and I'll turn it over to Claire.
Thanks, Cheryl. So now we're going to go through how you can use the type of change resource for assessment and reporting activities. And we're going to apply again the child care example. So to help illustrate how to use this resource, our examples show how to use the tool for assessment and reporting activities, like when you're developing the PPR, how to go through lessons learned and reflections, and how to evaluate the impact of the project. So, next slide, please. If you remember the child care example, the council wanted to change thinking, to change policies and procedures, change the expectations of families, increase the involvement of families to be active in advocacy, and increase support for child care providers.
And the solutions to the problems correlate to the following types of change found in column 1 of the resource. So we have policy and program changes, service design and delivery changes, and changes to attitudes, experiences, and expectations of people with ID and DD and their families. And now I'll pass it to Kim.
Thanks so much, Claire. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so we're going to break down the child care example a little bit further. So referencing the chart that Cheryl mentioned just a few slides ago and showed kind of the close-up, we want to look at each type of change and then the activities associated with that change and then the results that can be reported for the PPR. So for the first one in column 1, it's the policy and program changes. So the activities associated with that type of change, and per this particular child care example, we have changes to laws, regulations, policies, and procedures. And actually, this child care example is really great, right? Because it does kind of impact each of those areas. So per the child care example, 1 law was amended. So that's a reportable outcome. 1 regulation was updated and implemented. So another reportable outcome. 1 new policy was created and implemented. So this did impact 56 child care centers, but it's still just 1 policy for PPR reporting. And then 2 procedures were created, implemented, and sustained. Again, that's across the 56 licensed child care centers, but there's 2 procedures that can be reported. All right, next slide, please. So the next item that you would see in that column 1 that applies to this example is the service design and delivery. So what are the activities that relate to the service design and delivery activities? So we have design delivery, capacity, outreach, and expected outcomes. Now, when you look back at that chart, you'll see a few other items in that box too of activities. You don't need to meet every single one of those. You just need to meet at least one for that particular type of change to apply. So for the child care example, for design delivery, the 56 child care centers implemented a new type of service delivery. So that can be reported under promising or best practices in the PPR. Capacity building. So the child care center staff were trained on person-centered thinking and practice. An online resource was created and more trainings for new child care providers. So, and then there was follow-up data to demonstrate this change in not only attitude, but also practice. So again, this can be reported in the PPR as promising or best practices implemented and the number of people trained. And then we have outreach as well. So there were people with IDD and families not receiving childcare services who, as a result of the council efforts for this particular project, were now receiving services. So those folks can also be counted in the PPR and counted under the outreach. And then there are some additional kind of activities that can be reported in the PPR narrative, so they don't necessarily fit squarely under the data, but things that are worthwhile and of a value to report. So, you know, the question really is, how did the council meet its expected outcomes? Well, per the evaluation, 72% of families said that their expectations were met by these efforts. So that can go into the PPR narrative. And then in addition, we have one e-magazine dedicated to inclusive childcare. So that's another outcome that doesn't necessarily fit squarely into those previous categories, but that can and should be reported as a result of council efforts. All right, next slide, please. All right, and then the last one for this particular example that we'll discuss is attitudes, experiences, and expectations of people with IDD. So what are the activities? It's active participation and then active learning. So per their evaluation efforts, the council staff reported that 118 people with IDD and their family members were trained and supported to advocate for this effort, and that 90% of people with DD and their families were actively involved in advocacy efforts. So this is trained and supported in inclusive childcare and then advocating for inclusive childcare. So again, this can go into the PPR. And then we also want to think about the sustainability efforts, right? Because this is just 1 year where the council is reporting. So what are the follow-up efforts? How is the council evaluating that? And then can those be reported in subsequent years? All right, so I will pass it on to Tedra at this point.
You're on mute, Tedra. Check your mute. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, we understand council staff and members have different levels of understanding about systems change. And we try to create resources that would be helpful, but we need to hear from the people who use the resources. Next slide, please. So we have a request of you. We would like you to use the resource with 1 or 2 state plan activities that are systems change efforts. Since we're all working on our plans, we still have time to do so. And if you use any of these resources, can you let us know what you used? Tell us about how helpful the resource was, what we could do to improve the resource, and if you found other ways to use the resources, can you let us know that as well? We'd like your feedback by August 31st, and our group will review the feedback and make improvements to the resources. Next slide, please. This really concludes our session. We know a lot of information has been provided and encourage you to check out the systems change training module, the decision trees, the strategies, and the type of change resources under the TA Institute page on the itechhelp.org website. Just click the link 2021 OIDD virtual TAI to see all the materials. And we do have time for some questions. And so if anyone has questions, now would be the time. I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
Thanks, Tedra. That was a lot of information and such good stuff. Thank you to the Emerging Practices Group on Systems Change and Cheryl for all of that, all of these tools to keep something like systems change tracked and worked on. It's really important stuff. So thank you to all of you. But we do have a hand raised. Okay.
It looks like Rachel Dyer. You can go ahead and unmute. It may have been raised by mistake. It doesn't look like she's unmuting the line.
Okay, no problem. Any questions? Okay, for the record, I think I see one from Pam. Yes, the sessions are being recorded. The only thing that we can't record is the is when we went into breakout sessions. So they need to be transferred to a different format, and then they will be posted. So we'll let you know when the videos are available. Thank you for asking that, Pam. Any other questions? We'd also, since we have plenty of time, we'd love to maybe try to show you where all this great information is exactly. We know that the website has a lot of information, and if I can share my screen for a second, and then of course if you have any other questions, we'll be here. So this of course is your itachelp.org website, which has so much stuff. It's just amazing. So for what the Emerging Practices Group on Systems Change just presented, you would simply, for now, because this is where the resources are now, you would just go to TA Institute, and PM, this is also where all the presentations are already listed for everyone. Just as Tedra said, July 2021, OIDD, Virtual TAI, you simply click on that drop-down menu, and here are all the links to the presentations. And then Cheryl's group has its own section for under systems change, where it explains a lot of the information that we went over today, and then has direct links to the tools that we learned about. And even a link to the feedback questions, which is a separate document for download. So that is where all of that great information can be found. And then I'll just click over here on the DICLC button, and you should know, if you don't, we have multiple pages under here as well, archived webinars, DICLC resources, DICLC online strategies document, and then you have your new one that we just went over today, the top 10 practices on DICLC. And when we click on that, you will get, you'll get the resource two ways. So you can download a PDF here by clicking on this link. And then we've also broken the PDF down into sections, the sections that Kyoko went over for us. And all you do is, again, just simply click on it, and the content will drop down for whatever section you're interested in reading about. The definition and terms section is quite extensive. It's amazing. We have DDAC's terms, and then we also have other key terms related to DICLC. There's the video that Kyoko was talking about. We have the images that we went over today with Tawara and Wendy. Those were already in the resource for you. We even already had intersectionality in the resource for you. So the definitions and terms section, again, is quite extensive, a lot of great information, a lot of great links to more information. And then we get into the top 10 promising practices themselves. So they're all listed here, 1 through 10. These also have, as we said, tips and an FMI for more information link. So there's all of those. And then the rest of the resources all here divided out so that all you have to do is click on the piece that you are interested in. So those are the two spots where you can find all the great resources that we went over today. Cheryl, did you have anything else? Are there any other questions?
I see no open questions.
And I just cannot thank everybody involved in the TAI this year enough. It's been amazing to work with all of you. And hopefully you'll find all the follow-up information useful. As we get the videos linked, we will send something out as well. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy the TAI. So thank you so much.